The morning of October 6, 1976, began like any other in Bangkok. The city hummed with routine market vendors, traffic horns, school bells. But on the grassy field of Thammasat University, something far darker was unfolding. Smoke curled into the sky. Gunshots cracked like lightning. Bodies collapsed under the weight of hatred. This was no war zone. It was a university campus turned killing ground. In less than a day, one of the most horrifying massacres in Thai history would be unleashed, not by foreign invaders, not by rogue criminals, but by Thai police, paramilitary mobs, and ultra-right-wing vigilantes. They came armed with rifles, clubs, and a monstrous ideology, convinced that the students, those young, idealistic citizens, were a threat to the monarchy and the nation. By nightfall, at least 46 people lay dead. Some were shot, some were beaten to death, others were lynched, one was burned alive. Many were never identified. No one was punished. The world turned away. The government erased the evidence, but the memory survives. This is the true story of the Thammasat University massacre, a brutal moment buried under decades of denial, a moment where truth was crushed by tyranny, and yet a moment we must now remember. Part 1. Roots of Repression. Thailand's Dark Descent into Fear, 1973 to 1976. To understand how a modern university in central Bangkok became the site of a massacre, we must go back 3 years earlier to October 1973. Thailand was then under the grip of a military dictatorship led by Field Marshal Thammasat University, whose regime was known for corruption, censorship, and brutal suppression of dissent. But the winds of change were rising. Fueled by global movements for democracy, civil rights, and anti-imperialism, a new generation of Thai students began organizing protests against the military regime. These students, most of them from universities like Thammasat and Chulalongkorn, were not communists or radicals. They were idealists, young men and women who believed in democracy, accountability, and civil liberties. On October 14, 1973, a massive student-led protest drew over 400,000 people onto the streets of Bangkok. In a shocking turn, the military responded with deadly force, opening fire on protesters. At least 77 were killed. But the violence backfired. The Thai monarchy, led by King Bhumibol Adulyadej, intervened and forced the resignation of Thanom. For the first time in decades, Thailand entered a brief democratic interlude. Civilian governments took power, the press became freer, political parties emerged, and student activism exploded. But democracy was fragile and Thailand's ruling elites hated it. Between 1973 and 1976, Thailand became a battleground, not just of political ideas, but of Cold War paranoia. The collapse of Saigon in 1975 and the rise of communist regimes in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia sent shockwaves through Bangkok's royalist military establishment. They feared Thailand would be next. The CIA had deep ties with Thai generals. Right-wing newspapers and royalist politicians began to equate student activism with communist subversion. It didn't matter that the students were unarmed, non-violent, and mostly moderate. They were demonized as traitors, and the far right mobilized. Paramilitary groups, such as the Red Gores and Naofan, were formed, composed of ex-soldiers, royalists, monks, and thugs. They received weapons, money, and support from sections of the Thai police and military. Their mission: destroy the student movement. The propaganda was relentless. Posters warned of red infiltrators and atheist threats to Buddhism and the monarchy. Newspapers printed fabricated stories of communist plots to assassinate royal family members. One film shown in schools depicted students stabbing monks and spitting on Buddha images. In this climate of hysteria, violence became not just acceptable, but patriotic. In 1975, the left-leaning Prime Minister Sene Pramoj took office, attempting reforms and negotiating with student groups. But his coalition was weak, and the military watched closely. Meanwhile, student leaders continued their campaigns demanding land reform, workers' rights, and accountability for police abuses. In response, the right wing launched a campaign of terror. Students were attacked on the streets. Labor unionists were kidnapped and disappeared. One of the darkest signs came in August 1976, when two labor activists, Chanchai Srisathien and Bunsanon Penyudiana, were murdered. Their deaths went unpunished, and tension exploded. In September 1976, former dictator Thanom returned to Thailand. Despite being forced into exile after the 1973 uprising, he was welcomed back by the military and royalist elites disguised as a novice monk. For the students, this was intolerable. It was a slap in the face of justice. Protests reignited. On October 4, 1976, students at Thammasat University organized a play mocking the execution of pro-democracy activists. It was satire, but right-wing media spun it as lèse majesté, claiming the play insulted the Crown Prince. The Noafen Group, Village Scouts, and Red Gauze immediately called for vengeance. The newspapers screamed, "Kill the Red Traitors." Radio stations broadcast hate speeches calling for a final solution against the leftist scum, and the army prepared. At dawn on October 6th, the crackdown began. Thousands of students had camped overnight inside Thammasat University, planning a peaceful protest march to demand Thanom's removal and justice for the slain activists. They sang protest songs, they held banners, they had no weapons, but outside, heavily armed police, paramilitary mobs, and ultra-royalist militias gathered in fury. At 5:30 a.m., gunfire erupted. Snipers opened fire from nearby buildings. Tear gas canisters rained down. The students scattered, running for cover. Some tried to climb fences, others fled into university buildings. It was a massacre. By 7 a.m., the gate was breached. Riot police and Red Gauze stormed in, dragging students out. Some were shot on the spot. Others were lined up, hands tied, and executed. Female students were stripped and beaten. One male student was hung from a tree. Then his body was clubbed by a laughing crowd. Photographers captured the moment. The images of a lynched corpse being kicked by a man with a folding chair would become infamous. Yet no one in the crowd flinched. Some even cheered. Others posed for the cameras. By 11 a.m., the bloodbath slowed. At least 46 people were dead. Hundreds were injured. Over 3,000 students were arrested and trucked away. Some were tortured in military camps. Meanwhile, Thailand's military leaders claiming the students were plotting rebellion declared martial law. That evening, a military coup was announced. The elected government was dissolved, and the country returned to dictatorship under the National Administrative Reform Council (NARC), led by Admiral Sangaj Salariu. The public was told the massacre had saved Thailand from communism. State TV showed footage of monks blessing soldiers. The propaganda machine went into overdrive. The student movement was crushed. The survivors silenced, the dead forgotten. Part 2: Hell in Broad Daylight. The massacre unfolds as the sun rose higher on October 6, 1976. The Thammasat campus was transformed into a battlefield. The violence was no longer just an operation, it had turned into a spree of uncontrolled brutality. Paramilitary groups like the Red Gauze, Village Scouts, and Nawafon were allowed free rein. Under the cover of the police and in full view of news cameras, they attacked indiscriminately. They didn't just want to restore order, they wanted to destroy, humiliate, and make an example. Students were rounded up, dragged from classrooms, dormitories, and hiding spots. Many were made to crawl naked on the ground while they were kicked, spit on, and insulted. One female student was reportedly raped and then mutilated. Several male students were lynched in the university courtyard. Their bodies were desecrated, burned, beaten, and mocked. What was most disturbing was the public spectacle of the violence. It wasn't done in secret. It wasn't hidden. The killers wanted the world to see. One of the most iconic and horrifying photos from the massacre captured a moment frozen in time. A young man, hanged from a tree on the university grounds, his lifeless body swinging while a man smiled and hit the corpse with a folding chair. Others in the crowd laughed. This image would later be printed around the world, becoming the defining symbol of the massacre and of Thailand's descent into political madness. But the truth behind that photo was darker still. That student had not only been hanged, he had been tortured, beaten unconscious, and strung up while still alive. Thai society had crossed a line that day. Not only did the state sanction mass murder, but the people themselves, as ordinary citizens, civil servants, monks, and youths had become complicit in a wave of hate, and they believed they were doing it to protect the nation, religion, and king. By mid-morning, the university was secured by police and military forces. Blood stained the grass, bullet holes pierced walls and windows, fires burned. The dead were carried off in trucks, some to hospitals, some to disappear forever. Official numbers claimed only 46 were killed, but many eyewitnesses and survivors suggest the death toll may have been far higher. Hundreds more were severely wounded. Over 3,000 were arrested and held in mass detention centers. No effort was made to separate peaceful protesters from violent insurgents, because in truth, there were no armed insurgents. The students had carried no weapons. The communist plot the government claimed to have foiled was a complete fabrication. It was a lie created to justify a purge of the pro-democracy movement. The lies continued. Thai newspapers and radio stations praised the crackdown, calling it a restoration of peace. State-owned Channel 9 showed footage of students' bodies with narration blaming them for their own deaths. Officials staged fake displays of seized weapons, many of them rusty, outdated, or planted. The royal family remained silent. King Bhumibol did not condemn the violence. Instead, just hours after the massacre, he approved the appointment of a new Prime Minister, Thanin Krivichin, a right-wing judge known for his intense anti-communist views and open disdain for student activism. Thanin was appointed without election or public input. His government immediately began purging leftists, academics, and journalists. Universities were shut down, political parties banned, student organizations dissolved. It was as if the brief democratic dream of 1973 had never existed. Meanwhile, the survivors were left with broken bodies, haunted minds, and no recourse. Many fled the country. Some joined the Communist Party of Thailand (CPT), retreating into the jungles to wage a guerrilla war, not because they were communists by belief, but because they had no other refuge. Others disappeared. A few, like Seksan, Prozertikal, and Chacharon Chasing, would later re-emerge as politicians and intellectuals, but most never received justice. To this day, no one has been held accountable for the massacre. Not the police who shot unarmed students, not the mobs who lynched and raped, not the generals who staged the coup, not the ministers who lied to the world. Instead, many were promoted. Some became national heroes. The silence that followed was deafening. For decades, the massacre was barely mentioned in Thai history books. Survivors were warned not to speak. Journalists were threatened. Teachers avoided the topic. It wasn't until the 1990s that independent scholars and activists began slowly uncovering the truth. Archives were opened. Photographs emerged. Oral testimonies began to circulate. Yet even then, the state refused to apologize. In fact, the event remained so taboo that in 2008, when a student group tried to perform a play commemorating the massacre, they received death threats. Why this denial? Because the massacre wasn't just a crime, it was a revelation. It revealed the depth of Thai authoritarianism, the complicity of the royalist elite, and the fragility of Thai democracy. It showed how fear could be weaponized, how propaganda could turn neighbor against neighbor, and how violence could be sanctified under the banner of nationalism. Internationally, the massacre was condemned by human rights organizations, but few foreign governments dared challenge Thailand. The United States, a Cold War ally of the Thai military, remained silent. Washington feared that criticism would push Thailand closer to communism, just as it had in Laos and Cambodia. The UN issued no resolution. No tribunal was held. The world moved on. Domestically, the political impact was immediate. Thanin's regime began an era of deep repression. Thousands were imprisoned without trial. Press freedoms vanished. Universities were placed under strict control. Yet Thanin's hardline stance alienated even the military, and in 1977, he was overthrown in yet another coup, this time by more moderate generals who sought to stabilize the country, but the damage had been done. The pro-democracy movement was shattered. The ghosts of October 6th lingered in every classroom, every newsroom, every political debate. Fear became a permanent feature of Thai public life. In the years that followed, Thai politics would swing between fragile democracy and military coups. Every time students tried to rise again, the memory of 1976 would hang over them. The massacre became both a warning and a curse. A reminder that in Thailand, democracy could be drowned in blood with impunity. Part 3. No one was guilty. The echoes of impunity. In the aftermath of the massacre, the bloodstains on the courtyard were scrubbed, the bodies buried, and the university reopened within weeks. The junta, now firmly in control, moved quickly to erase the memory of October 6th. But trauma is not so easily washed away. For those who survived, for those whose loved ones never came home, and for those who dared to ask questions, the real wounds were only beginning to open. Thailand did not hold anyone accountable. There were no war crime charges, no trials, no reckoning. Instead, a veil of impunity descended over the nation, casting a long shadow that endures to this day. After Thanin Krivichin was installed as Prime Minister by royal endorsement on October 8, 1976, a wave of ultra-right-wing repression blanketed the country. Thousands were arrested across Thailand on vague suspicions of being leftist. Students, teachers, monks, journalists, anyone who had been remotely connected to the reformist or pro-democracy movement were branded enemies of the state. Even libraries were raided for subversive books. Meanwhile, a campaign of disinformation was launched. Government-aligned media spread the narrative that the student movement had been infiltrated by communists trained in Hanoi and Beijing. Protesters were accused of plotting to overthrow the monarchy, kill the royal family, and establish a Red Thailand. These claims, entirely baseless, were used to justify the massacre and the sweeping arrests that followed. Incredibly, even the public display of the atrocities was suppressed. Photographs taken by international journalists, images of students being beaten, hanged, and burned circulated abroad, shocking the world. But in Thailand, those photos were banned. Domestic media fell silent. For most Thais, what really happened that day was hidden behind a fog of lies. In total, 3,094 students were arrested after the massacre. Most were detained without charge for weeks or months in military camps. Many were beaten, forced to sign confessions, or psychologically tortured. Among those imprisoned were students who hadn't even been at Thammasat, up simply for their associations or political leanings. And yet, not a single person from the police, army, or paramilitary mobs was ever charged with a crime. The infamous photograph of a man using a folding chair to bludgeon a corpse hanging from a tree. No one was investigated. The commanding officers who gave the order to open fire on the campus, untouched. The men who paraded severed heads on bamboo poles through the streets, never identified. Worse, many of the key perpetrators were rewarded. General Sayut Kotphon, who led the military operation against Thammasat, continued to rise in the ranks. Thanin Krivichin, the ultra-right ideologue, ruled Thailand with iron repression until he himself was ousted in the 1977 coup by yet another junta. Other ultra-conservative leaders, such as Samak Sundararae, who publicly justified the massacre, would later serve as Bangkok governor and even prime minister. The victims were painted as traitors, brainwashed radicals, and enemies of Thai tradition. Their families received no compensation, no apology, no justice. Faced with a country that branded them terrorists and a government that hunted them, Many student activists fled into exile. Thousands went underground, joining the Communist Party of Thailand (CPT), whose jungle strongholds became the only safe haven for many of the survivors. Some had never held a weapon in their lives, but were now forced to train as guerrilla fighters, not by ideology, but by necessity. The forest life was brutal. Disease, hunger, and violence consumed many. By the early 1980s, the CPT was crumbling, squeezed by military pressure and ideological disillusionment. Some students defected, some were killed, others simply disappeared. But through it all, they never forgot October 6th. For decades, the Thammasat massacre was a historical taboo in Thailand. It was not taught in schools. It was rarely discussed in public. Survivors carried their trauma in silence, sometimes even hiding their past to avoid being blacklisted or harassed. This silence was not just societal, it was institutional. Every attempt to investigate or memorialize the massacre faced resistance. Proposals to open a parliamentary inquiry were dismissed. Media outlets who tried to cover the story were warned to tread carefully. Memorial events were often small, held in quiet corners of Thammasat's campus, guarded by police watching carefully from a distance. Even commemorative efforts were sometimes co-opted. In the 1990s, the October 6, 1976 memorial was unveiled at Thammasat, but it was tucked behind the university, largely unknown to the public. The Thai state preferred it that way, hidden, unspoken, unresolved. Despite the repression, truth could not be erased entirely. In the 2000s, a new generation of researchers, journalists, and activists began to dig deeper. Oral history projects were launched. Photographs long hidden in archives were published. Survivors began to speak openly. One of the most iconic figures was Seksan Presateko, a former student leader who narrowly escaped death that day. After returning from exile, he became a professor and writer, working tirelessly to ensure the truth of October 6th would not be forgotten. Others like Chanvet Kasitsiri, a Thammasat historian, and Piwi Un, the university rector who resigned in protest, were pivotal in shaping the academic understanding of the events. In 2016, on the 40th anniversary, a major exhibition was held at the Bangkok Art and Culture Center (BACC), titled Remember, October 6th. It featured never-before-seen photos, testimonies, and historical documents. The exhibition drew tens of thousands, shocking younger generations who had never been taught about the massacre in school. The veil of silence was finally beginning to tear. The ghosts of October 6th still linger in Thailand today. In moments of political unrest, like the red shirt protests in 2010, or the 2020 youth-led uprising, there are echoes of Thammasat. The same rhetoric is recycled. Protesters are accused of threatening the monarchy, of importing foreign ideology, of destabilizing Thai values. The same threats are made. The same violence looms. The students of 1976 asked for democracy, justice, and freedom. 40 years later, their spiritual descendants asked for the same. But the structures of impunity remain. Even today, Thailand's defamation and lèse-majesté laws are among the harshest in the world. Peaceful protesters can still be jailed for merely questioning royal authority. Military coups continue to occur with disturbing regularity, and the names of those responsible for October 6th are still spoken carefully, if at all. If there is one thing that makes the Thammasat massacre uniquely tragic, it is not just the savagery of the violence. It is the total, systemic erasure of justice. In 1978, all charges were dropped against those arrested on October 6th. The reason? The junta announced a royal pardon. Not only were the prisoners released, but it was framed as an act of mercy. No one else was charged. The case was closed. In the eyes of the Thai state, there was no crime. And if there was no crime, then there were no criminals, no murderers, no rapists, no torturers, just forgotten students in unmarked graves. But memory has a way of surviving even the most brutal efforts to destroy it. Each year, on October 6th, a small but determined group gathers at Thammasat University. They light candles, They place roses where bodies once lay. They recite the names of the dead, and slowly, more people join them. Younger Thais, tired of the lies, have started asking hard questions. Why were those students killed? Who gave the orders? Why has no one been punished? Social media has made it harder for the state to hide the truth. Photographs of the massacre are now widely accessible. Documentaries, books, and podcasts in Thai and English explore the event in detail. The tide is shifting. Justice may not yet have been served, but memory is alive. What happened at Thammasat was not an accident. It was not a clash or a misunderstanding. It was a coordinated massacre by state forces, enabled by a propaganda campaign, fueled by hatred and shielded by silence. It was a war crime never named, never prosecuted, never resolved. And it is a lesson about how fear can be weaponized, about how easily truth can be buried, about the cost of unchecked power. But most of all, it is a story about courage. The courage of students who stood up, the courage of survivors who spoke out, the courage of a new generation determined to know their history, even if it bleeds. Because only through memory can we hope to resist repetition. Only through truth can we begin to heal. Only through justice can a massacre become more than just a footnote. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history.